So before we get into today's conversation, we have to tell you something. This show is not called Impact anymore. As of today, we're Perdure. It means to last, to persist through change without losing what you are. Once we learned about this word, we thought it would be perfect for our podcast. Girl Scouts, 113 years. Save the Children, 107. UNICEF, 80. Komen, 44. Every organization we've covered on this show has had to perdure, to survive funding shocks, leadership crises, reputational hits, even wars, without losing the thing that made them matter in the first place. So while we're still concerned about impact, we're also focused on what it takes to perdure. We will have some new music to go along with our new name.
And we have another change too. Every 4 or 5 episodes, we're going to step back from a deep dive into individual organizations and bring in one of the best thinkers on nonprofits and the business models underneath them. These will be conversations, not case studies. We decided to do this because every deep dive we do keeps running into the same handful of underlying questions. How do you measure impact? How do you plan under uncertainty? How do you keep donors as partners instead of just as wallets? We'll ask the people who've spent their careers thinking about these questions, starting with today's first conversational episode.
And quick disclaimer, same as always, Perdure is for information and entertainment only. Nothing here is financial, legal, or professional advice. The views are ours alone, not our employers, not our clients, not anyone we've ever worked for. And now, we're part of the DevX Podcast Network.
We fact-check against primary and published sources, and we correct mistakes. So if you catch something, tell us. I'm Alyssa Stern.
And I'm Revi Sterling, and this is Perdure. Our first guest is David Schizer. He's Dean Emeritus of Columbia Law School, and he actually became dean at 35, the youngest in the school's history, and served the longest of anyone since 1971. He's one of the nation's leading tax scholars, and his research also covers nonprofits, energy law, and corporate governance. In 2017, he took a 3-year leave from Columbia to become Executive Vice President and CEO of the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, JDC, a century-old international humanitarian organization with a budget of about $360 million a year. He redesigned how JDC planned and allocated that budget, brought in more data-driven decision-making from the business world, and grew and diversified its donor base. So when he writes about nonprofits, he's not just observing them. He's run too. He's also the author of How to Save the World in 6 Not-So-Easy Steps, Bringing Out the Best in Nonprofits.
David, thanks so much for your time and your interest in joining us today and for being our first person to be interviewed.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Alyssa, Revi, thanks so much for inviting me.
We're taking it as a good sign that our new name, Perdure, begins with the letter P, which is the letter that each of your 6 not-so-easy steps to bring out the best in nonprofits begins with. So to get us going with our new name, we wondered, in the context of nonprofits, organizations that are supposed to be built around a mission, not around self-preservation, what does the word perdure mean to you? Is durability itself a virtue?
So obviously, impact is critical, and we want the impact that we have to last, not just to be some temporary thing. So I think impact needs to be lasting. Certainly, missions are usually lasting and even permanent because they transcend specific situations. If you're about helping vulnerable populations, I'm sorry to say it, but I think there will always be vulnerable populations in the world, and it is a perennial, I think, sacred calling to try to address that. And at the same time, what I definitely think should not, must not endure is the particular way we've done things in the past. Even as we are committed to a mission that is eternal, we have to remember that the best way to pursue that mission could change every year, even every week. And we have to have an open mind and keep moving.
So you've managed a large, complex nonprofit, and you've presumably advised or studied all the for-profit businesses too, given your economics background. What is the actual difference between managing a nonprofit versus managing a for-profit? Not the mission, but the actual management problem.
So Revi, I'll just say that I think in ways they're really similar because it's got to be about being efficient, being effective, being dynamic. But there is a really fundamental difference, which in my opinion just makes nonprofit management a lot harder. If you tell me you're running a for-profit business, my job is to maximize risk-adjusted profit. And that's easy to get my head around. And most importantly, it's easy to measure. On the other hand, if you tell me I'm running a nonprofit, my goal is to advance the mission as impactfully and efficiently as possible. But it's so much harder to measure that. You definitely don't want to look at cash flows and say, hey, we're bringing in more money. We must be doing it the right way. Quite the opposite. And so I think everybody who works in nonprofits understands that at some level of abstraction, we know what we're trying to do, but actually making sure that we're doing it and making the choices that point us in the right direction, that's really hard. It's really hard for people who are committed and capable. And the one other thing I'll say, and I say it with a little bit of sadness, not everybody at nonprofits is as committed or capable as we would like. And so there's another problem that goes along with this, which is, how do we know that the choices the nonprofit is making, how do we know that those are the best for the mission? Maybe instead they're just the best for a handful of people who are running the nonprofit, and we always have to be vigilant about that.
There's so much in that, David, that we'd love to unpack, from impact to measurement, and really how you manage well. So in your book, you talk about these 6 Ps for nonprofits. In our experience, we see a lot of different Ps. We see procrastinate, pander, patchwork, paralyze, presume, penny pinch, and more. But you talk about plan, prioritize, pivot, persevere, publicize, and partner. I hope I got those Ps right.
You did.
For the listeners who haven't read your book yet, and listeners, if you haven't, you really should. David, can you walk us through each of those briefly? And then tell us, in your experience advising and running organizations, which of these is the hardest for nonprofits to actually execute, not only understand?
Absolutely. And maybe before I do, I'll just emphatically echo the point you made that there is both good, inspiration, but also bad in nonprofits. And maybe just to illustrate that, I'll share a memory that I did not put in the book. So as Revi mentioned, I spent some time away from Columbia as CEO of an amazing nonprofit, JDC. And I had 2 conversations with 2 veterans just as I was starting, which I think really, for me at least, concretized that difference. So I sat down with the first, and he said to me, David, I don't care about JDC at all, and neither should you, which is an interesting thing to say to the new CEO, but I knew there was more coming. And he says, because what I care about is JDC's clients and JDC's mission. And keep in mind that there are choices we've made over the years that you might not think make sense. And I personally may be responsible for some of those choices. And what I want to say to you is, it's not that you have my permission. You have a moral obligation to change what isn't working, because I don't care about JDC at all. I care about JDC's clients. And personally, I don't think I've ever heard a better articulation of the way we're supposed to think about the nonprofit world than that. Really, it's got to be about the mission. It's not about us. It's not about sticking to the minutia of the past. But I'll just reference a second conversation that I had the same week with another veteran. And we sat down, and he said, I'm going to tell you how we do things here at JDC. And then he went through the details of his job, and it wasn't quite at the level of, I use purple paper clips for this and I use red paper clips for that, but we were getting close. It was that level of detail. And at the end of a 45-minute conversation, I said to him, we both know that I have a lot to learn and that it would help me enormously to learn more about this place, and you know so much. In our next conversation, it would be great if you could maybe tell me a bit about what you'd like to see changed here. You must have been frustrated by things. There must have been things that have disappointed you. You might even think they're impossible to change, but I'd love to know, because I am committed to trying to make this place better. Well, I didn't get a very positive reaction to that. He looked at me as if a second head had sprouted on my shoulders, said he'd think about it. And when he came back for the next conversation, he said, I know you want to hear what I think should change at JDC, but I'm just going to tell you how we do things here. And so again, the commitment to the mission is admirable, but a commitment to the details, the specific details of how we conducted the mission at a particular point in time, that is the wrong focus. It can distract us. It can even lead us very much astray. So to get back to your excellent question, I think the two things that are critical at a nonprofit are, first of all, to be analytical, to analyze, to figure out the best way to advance the mission now in this changing world. Consider options, look at data, try experiments, figure out what you think is best. But honestly, that's only half of the battle, and maybe it's not even half, because if you alone know the right thing to do, then you're very limited in the way you can get it done, because obviously everybody else, the professionals, the donors, the volunteers, they all need to be right there with you, pushing in the same direction. Which is why the second thing that you really need to do is advocacy. It's getting everybody on board. And so you need to make sure that the people who are going to do the work believe in it and want to get it done and understand it and are contributing. So really, it's these two things. It's figuring out how to advance the mission most effectively and getting everybody on board. And that's what the 6 Ps are about. So we have 3 that focus especially on analyzing and figuring out what to do. And that's plan. You need the right planning process. Prioritize. No nonprofit can do everything. Figure out what you need to do. And pivot. Make changes. Run experiments. But then at the same time, you have to get everybody on board. And so persevere is the word that I use to describe that process of including people in decisions and making them feel ownership in what you need to do. There's also publicize. Share the details of what you're doing and hold yourself accountable. And then the last P is partner, which is about treating your funders as partners and getting them involved. And for me, I would say the hardest is persevere, because people are passionate at nonprofits, a P that I didn't put in there, but it absolutely fits. And they may initially have a different view than your view, and you want to hear them and you want to work together to come up with the best approach. It takes time and it takes a lot of work.
Well, thank you for sharing those. That's so salient, especially given everything that's happening in the sector at the moment. Government funding volatility, donor pressure, the political environment nonprofits are operating in. Which P do you think is particularly hard, and has that changed over time? And what's your actual advice to a nonprofit leader trying to hold on to that one under current conditions?
So one part of persevere that I think is coming under increasing pressure now, and there I used still another P, pressure. One of them is really just getting everybody on board when you have a diverse community of people united by the mission of the nonprofit, but possibly very much in disagreement about other issues. And so the point is, it is not unusual now for nonprofit leaders to be under a bit of pressure from some of their stakeholders to take positions on issues, maybe positions on issues that are not quite related to their mission. And I personally think it's very important to resist doing that, because otherwise you might find yourself being a nonprofit devoted to a mission that has only a fraction of the people who should be helping you, because the positions you've taken on unrelated issues have persuaded other people to defect and form their own because they aren't comfortable with those positions. So I do think in a world where everyone is a bit more polarized, perhaps, than used to be the case, that has spillover effects in the nonprofit world, because even though you've got people who are passionate about your mission and that hasn't changed, you have to work really hard to keep everybody together.
The whole idea of, advocacy in order to persevere and analyzing, and maybe the need to pivot as a result of that analysis, brings up, as you say, so many challenges. And one of the challenges of the pivoting that we see a lot is the tension of grant funding being tied to specific outputs, not outcomes. So, funder wants X meals delivered, or they want, X people trained. So can you talk a little bit about how a nonprofit is supposed to experiment and pivot when the grant money is tied to some specific actions? And nonprofits might worry about deviating from what they promised the funder.
I have a lot of sympathy for that concern that a lot of people at nonprofits have. We're known for this. Our donors like it. We need to keep delivering it, even though we know that it may not be the very best way to go anymore. It used to be, but the world has changed. And what's more, we've made commitments that this is what we're supposed to be doing. We have to measure it. And the measuring doesn't even make a lot of sense to us, but nevertheless, this is what we're told we have to do. I get it. I've been there. I think the point is, though, that the best kind of leadership is able to get your funders on board also for a new direction. And if you think about it, this is actually an enormous service to your funders because, like you, they're passionate and committed about abstract goals. But unlike you, they may not devote 18 hours a day to thinking about the best way to do it. And they're depending on the people at nonprofits to think of better ways and to bring them those opportunities. When I first started raising money for Columbia Law School all these years ago, the first few weeks I felt a little uncomfortable. Gee, I'm sort of asking. And I have a friend who, in giving an early gift, said, "Thank you for the opportunity," which opened my eyes to the fact that this is not a favor that they're doing. People who care about a cause are looking for effective ways to do it. And the truth is, if they trust that you're the creative, disciplined person who's going to bring them the best new ideas, they will happily fund you. It's just about making the case to them and then this is key, holding yourself accountable, being sure that you share the results. Some of them, sometimes it isn't good. You tell them that. Sometimes it's great, and you tell them that. But again, I think this is part of that partnering notion. Bring them inside the tent, make them a part of the decision making, and tell them when something can be better and you need their help.
Wow, thank you. It's really relevant to my work for certain right now. Um, I'd love to talk a little bit about measurement and how you let people under the tent that way. If you're running a nonprofit, how do we actually measure our own impact and not just the metrics that our board wants to see on a PowerPoint slide and what the donors are really engaged with, but the ones that honestly tell if we're doing the work well?
Revi, this is the billion-dollar question. Because the truth is it's different at every nonprofit, or at least it's different across sectors. And what we would do at JDC to be sure that we were caring for vulnerable people with home care and food is pretty different than what we would do at Columbia Law School when we were trying to train lawyers for a changing and dynamic world. But on the other hand, the idea is, I think your first question for yourself is, how do I know it's working? What do I wish I knew? And sometimes there are things that are just so hard to measure that we can't. But if we're creative, we'll come up with things that we trust. And if we trust them, then our funders should trust them. And I think everybody who's been involved in this sort of effort knows that funders sometimes come in and say, we'd like you to measure these 4 things. And sometimes they're exactly the right 4 things. And when that happens, it's fantastic and they've helped you and they're giving you more than just money. They're giving you a great idea about how to improve. But the reality is that sometimes they're not the right things to measure. And that's not surprising because maybe you're just a lot closer to what you're trying to achieve than they are. And so there are things that you realize that are not obvious to them. And so I have heard many nonprofit professionals grumble about being asked to assemble useless data, which they're never going to use just for the funder. And I think that's terrible. It's just a waste of the funder's money and it's a waste of people's time. But I think there's an answer to that. And I've been pretty successful at this. When I'm asked to measure things that I don't think are the right things to do, I'll say, hey, I know what you're looking for. Let me tell you what we do internally. And here's why we do it internally. And we thought about what you're suggesting. And here's why we didn't do it. And what I'd really like to do is to share you the things that we think matter the most, share with you the things we think matter the most. Would that be okay? And almost every time I've had that conversation, people have said yes, because really what they're looking for is effective management. And they're trying to nudge you in that direction, but they're thrilled if you're already doing the kind of thing that they want.
That's really suggesting an open conversation between the nonprofit and the donor, which is both not typical and sometimes not practical, either because the donor has put out an RFP or the nonprofit may have had a negative experience with that kind of conversation. How do you open the door for those kind of really useful conversations to happen?
So you point out the concerns very, very insightfully. And so I agree that this is not the easy way to go, but I firmly believe that it's the best way to go. And so there's an old adage about fundraising, which is if you ask for money, you get advice. And if you ask for advice, you get money. Because the goal is for funders to feel as if the nonprofit's goals are their personal goals, and the nonprofit's challenges are their personal challenges. And suddenly they're thinking of it as my work, not their work. And they're thinking of successes as my successes, not their successes. And in my experience, when someone feels that way about a nonprofit, they will be substantially more generous because it becomes a personal mission for them. And that's fantastic. And the question is, how do you get there? And I go back to that advice point. Like it shouldn't be that your only contact with them is to ask for money for a specific thing that's already been predefined. Ideally, what you're doing is you're developing a long-term partnership where you call them up and you say, this just happened, and I have a few thoughts about it, and I'd really like to run them by you because it would help me to hear your reaction, and I may be missing something. And I can't count the number of conversations like that I've had. But what I can tell you is that I have rarely felt trapped by the conversation where, having had it, I feel like I can't go back to them with something different. And it's partly just a matter of framing. I'm still thinking this through, and I know that you've probably encountered situations like this. What have you done, right? And it is valuable to me. Like I learn things, and at the same time, I think that it builds the kind of relationship which allows for the sort of collaboration we've been talking.
I love that. It just means we have to have those conversations. Wow. A little bit of a shift. If you're outside the organization, how do you actually know when a nonprofit is good at the 6 Ps? What's visible from the outside that tells you that plan, prioritize, pivot, persevere, publicize, and partner are actually happening versus an organization that just talks about them all well? I'm just thinking, the LinkedIn mentality of organizations these days. Everything looks like it's going swimmingly.
I think this is a huge problem, Revi, and I think it's a huge problem not only for the donors, although it's a challenge, but for our sector. Because in my experience, if you ask me, is it difficult to find a group of people with a lot of capacity to help who are moved by your mission? I would say no, it's not difficult. If I'm inspired by a mission, I bet you there are thousands of people who are also inspired by it. And we know that from our own experience. The hardest part is not persuading them that the mission is important. It's persuading them that you have the competence, the efficiency, the determination, the ability to deliver on what you're saying you will do. And so I suspect that if more nonprofits were more transparent with the kind of evidence that's really persuasive that things are going well, I think the whole sector would be raising more money, because I think there's a lot of potential donations out there that don't happen because people are cynical, frankly, about, that sounds great. I've heard that before. I wish it were true, but no, I'm not going to waste my money, right? So one of the things that we did at JDC while I was CEO turned out to be an amazingly successful fundraising device, even though I have to be honest, I didn't think about it in those terms at first. We started doing a very detailed annual plan, which focused on all of our major programs, talked about what we were still going to do with evidence of why, talked about what we weren't going to do anymore with an explanation of why we were phasing it out. There was a lot in there. I sort of think about it as a contract that everybody at the organization was making with each other. And for me, that was the original purpose, was to be sure that everybody, JDC is a wonderfully large organization with people spread across many continents and thousands of miles. And it's really important that everyone has a clear sense of what we're all going to be doing. And then what we decided to do was we decided to disclose that publicly. And so we posted it on our website. We would share it with potential donors. And it was wonderful because this was the kind of information most nonprofits weren't sharing, which made people say things like, I've always been looking for something like this. And they would give us a lot more. So I am not a fan of sort of generalities and anecdotes and we're great. And like, you have to get really specific about what's working and how you know. But I believe that the nonprofits that do that can then have a very significant fundraising advantage.
One of the things, David, you mentioned when you and I were talking about this report that you put out was that you also mentioned the failures, not only what you're not going to do any longer and why, but also what didn't work. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So I actually realize that it is an especially delicate thing to speak candidly with the donor about the fact that the money they gave you was used in a way that didn't really work. I understand that that's something we all dread. I actually think it's important. And I think it's important for two reasons. First of all, we should not underestimate the value of failure because think about what we learned from it, right? We tried it. We thought it was going to work for this reason. There was this factor we didn't anticipate. Not sure we could have, wish we had, but we didn't. But now we know. And so we're going to take that knowledge with us with all the other things that we try to do going forward. That's actually a very valuable thing. And so disclosing that publicly can help other nonprofits avoid similar pitfalls. The other thing that I think is so good about it is if I'm willing to tell you what didn't go well, then maybe you'll believe me more when I say this was fantastic. And in my experience, you really do get significant credibility. And so it is something that very few people want to do, I know, but I am a believer in it because I think that that kind of candor adds value and builds relationships.
You've touched on all the big ones, the cynicism, the candor, information, especially in this current funding environment and political environment we're in right now. What do you think the biggest misconception the public and donors have about nonprofits and how they're actually run? What is something that you find yourself correcting for people again and again?
So one of the things that I have reservations about is using overhead as a strict measure of whether an organization is effective. And I may be surprising some people in saying this because I am such a fanatic when it comes to trying to be efficient. I really think that the goal of a nonprofit is not for us to feel good about what we're doing. It's for our, the people we're trying to help to be helped and to be helped as much as possible. So really, to me, impact is everything. But I think that overhead can be quite a flawed measure of impact. And so I will just share two reasons why I think that's true. The first is, unfortunately, I think nonprofits are quite inconsistent in the way they calculate it. And so in theory, what you're supposed to do is you're supposed to say there's this category, it's administration, it's not program. How much are we spending on administration? How does that compare with our overall budget? And obviously a lower number is better. So what that means is there's this heavy incentive to classify something as program, not as administration. So I'll take something that I've always thought pretty clearly was administration, unquestionably so, and that's fundraising. So if you pay people to try to generate interest in your cause and to encourage people to support it financially, that's really important. But I do think that it's overhead. On the other hand, there's an argument some people make that part of the mission is publicizing what you do. It's educational. And then they say education is program. And a significant portion of the time of fundraisers is education. Because after all, if they have 4 meetings with a donor, 3/4 of those at least won't involve a request for money. And so, hey, why don't we say 75% of their time is program because it's education? So I don't endorse that approach. Let me be clear. But I think enough organizations do things like that they will seem to have much lower overheads than organizations that frankly are run exactly the same way. So I think overhead can be misleading. But the other more fundamental concern that I have about it is that I actually think some forms of overhead are urgently needed and great for program. So for example, I think an organization that doesn't do serious planning every year to rethink what works and what doesn't is making a terrible mistake, and they could maybe be wasting a lot of people's money. But there are ways in which you could think of a planning process as administration instead of program. We could debate that. But if it's actually overhead, then it's really good overhead. And the last thing that I'll say about this is that different kinds of work inherently require different levels of overhead. At JDC, we did a lot of really important work in Israel. We did a lot of really important work in the former Soviet Union. And there's a difference. And the difference is that the state of Israel has an effective law enforcement capability and serious auditing. And so when you do business there, the level of auditing is about like what you'd need in the United States. It's about like what you'd need in Western Europe. But when you're operating in former Soviet republics, the risk of corruption, I'm sorry to say it, is significantly, significantly higher, which means that you need to invest a lot more in accounting, in monitoring, in fiscal controls. And that's all overhead. And at the same time, frankly, the wage rates in these places are a lot lower. So program is cheaper, which means that our overhead in Israel was a lot lower than our overhead in the former Soviet Union. But if you ask me, does that tell me that the work in Israel was more socially valuable? I'd say absolutely not. There are other ways we could talk about which was more valuable, but that doesn't tell me anything, in my view. So a longer answer than maybe you needed, but I think overhead is a common misconception.
Really interesting. I mean, the whole dynamic between efficiency and impact, and how that reveals itself. Something we've been thinking about is the dynamic between time and impact. Can you talk a little bit about, short-term impact versus long-term, behavioral and systems change, and what advice you can give about measuring, both either from the organization's point of view or from a potential donor?
What a wonderful question, because there's this saying people have in management. Obviously, you manage what you measure, and that can sometimes lead to unfortunate outcomes because it might skew you in the direction of favoring things that are where it's easy to show good results and avoiding the things where it's hard to demonstrate the results. But that's the wrong thing to do if the things that are harder to measure are more important. So I think what we always prefer, if we can do it, is systemic change that over the long term is really transformative, as opposed to more modest gains that you can see immediately. And then the question is, how do we avoid this bias? How do we measure? And it's difficult. I won't lie. It's difficult. Doesn't mean you can't do it. And my own approach to that question is just we need to be really explicit about it. We need to be very open with ourselves and with anyone who's asking, including funders, about what we're trying to do, how we know, and the limits of what we can know. But over the years, I've come to the conclusion that you can actually learn a lot, even about long-term issues, if you think about it the right way.
Let's say even a individual donor who wants to write $100 check. If it's to an organization that is looking to change long-term behavior, to equalize gender, to give people a voice, to make people self-sustainable, so many long-term things. What can an individual donor who doesn't have the capacity of a foundation to do due diligence, to do a deep dive into what the organization's doing, how does an individual donor choose between two organizations who are in the same field? How do they evaluate long-term systems change?
It's really important that people think this way. And it's also challenging, particularly for people who don't have access to inside information about how an organization is doing because they're not major donors, and so they can't ask for the meeting and for the information that wouldn't otherwise have been disclosed. But having said that, I am a great believer in asking 3 questions when we allocate resources. And this is something that my colleagues and I came up with at JDC for our own internal budgeting. But I think it's also relevant here. And the first question is, how important is the problem? And this is quite relevant to someone who's deciding where to give their money. Which of these missions are compelling to me and why? In the world that we live in, should I be focusing more on X or on Y or on Z? And obviously, at some level, they're all appealing, but what's especially important now? The second question is, how effective is the response? And the third is this the right organization to do it? And what I want to emphasize is loving the mission, being inspired by the mission. Well, that's necessary, but it's absolutely not sufficient. Because someone can take your money, talk about the mission, tell you a story, and not deliver any results. And that's not what we want. We want to know that the organization can actually deliver. And so, look, people can devote their entire all of their waking hours to trying to figure this out. And I know that when we write a $100 check, we're not going to do that. But there are some things we can do. What is the organization telling me on the website about their strategy? And there are, different kinds of strategies. There's, for example, if you're looking for gender equality, there are people who do impact litigation. And if that's the strategy, you'd kind of want to know what they've succeeded in doing in the past and the kinds of court cases they're looking to bring now. Others are much more interested in kind of a broad-based effort to help individuals more directly in their lives. That's a very commendable thing to do. And you might think you prefer to support that instead of impact litigation, or the other way around. But knowing enough to know what they're trying to do is helpful. And then what's even better is if the organization is actually willing to give you more detail about what they're doing and why it's working. And as I said, I think that that's much less common. And so in my opinion, when an organization does that, that's a great sign, and maybe you lean in their direction.
Wow, thank you so much. And thank you for being our first guest on Perdure. I mean, it's been wonderful learning from you, and truly it's an honor that you spent this time with us. It's really helped me remember what's important and helped me recommit to the 6 Ps. So we look forward to future conversations.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks so much, David. We really appreciate your insights, inspiration. Next time, we're going to be back into the deep dives into organizations, but every 4 or 5, we'll talk with people like David, who are the movers and shakers in the field of nonprofits.
And thanks for listening to the new Perdure. Please follow us and rate us. We like 5 stars like Uber and Lyft. Share this episode, and we will see you next time.